Hey everyone, it's Alex from the PCRI, and today I have the honor of interviewing a man named Bill Manning. He has recently joined our team, but he's actually followed PCRI and been part of us for quite some time. He has a pretty incredible story when it comes to active surveillance and his 14-year journey in that space. He educates patients now all across the world from organizations that he's involved in, and he is not only an educator, but an advocate for active surveillance. And today we're going to hear more about his journey and get our questions answered. So, Bill, what year were you diagnosed with prostate cancer?
I was diagnosed with prostate cancer in 2009.
And what was that experience like for you? I know for patients it can be so intimidating and scary.
Being diagnosed was very intimidating. The whole process began because I was initially trying to get some life insurance. And when I got a physical, I came up with a 4.1 PSA, which was 0.1 over, quote, normal, end quote. So I decided to get a second PSA just to verify, and that came in at 6. And at that point, it was straight to the urologist, straight for the biopsy, and straight to the diagnosis of prostate cancer.
So how old were you?
I was 57.
You know, when you went to go get your PSA test, was it your family physician who was, giving you that?
No, actually, we bypassed the GP and I went straight to the urologist.
Okay, and what was that first visit like?
The first visit was very straightforward. He was a rather no-nonsense urologist. He mentioned that I would be a great candidate for surgery, that radiation was an option, and, well, if I really wanted to know more about watchful waiting, he could tell me about that, which was basically no treatment. But he strongly felt that surgery was my best option.
You're 57 years old, you find yourself at the urologist's office, and all of a sudden he's talking about surgery within a rather short time frame. Was this... did he explain different types of prostate cancer? Did he tell you your Gleason score? How did that go?
I was told my Gleason score, and I was told in very vague terms that that was a low-risk category. But low risk was not explained pretty much, and I assumed what he meant was low risk of death, which of course is not the case. That was not very helpful. The one thing he did do, and this was through the HMO I belonged to, was I was sent to, they called them counselors, but essentially it was a psychologist. That she did in fact go into a bit more detail about the process, about prostate cancer and where I was in this sequence. And that was helpful, but it was still steering me more heavily towards surgery.
So that's not typical that a lot of people are sent to a counselor. That's very interesting. Was that part of your HMO?
That was part of the HMO.
Okay.
I give them a lot of credit for having that available because urologists, including mine, tend to be very cut and dry. And they just lay out A, B, and C, and it's, okay, which one would you like? Whereas the counselor did in fact go into quite a bit more detail.
Well, it's interesting because I think there's a couple unique things about your case. Number one, the counselor, as we've mentioned, but also your urologist mentioning watchful waiting. Now, in order to have a diagnosis, obviously they did a biopsy, so I'm guessing it was a random needle biopsy?
I had a random 12-core needle biopsy. They found 5% Gleason 6 cancer in one sample.
So one core is positive with Gleason 6 and they're talking about surgery.
For me, it put up a number of red flags. I felt that having any kind of surgery, and especially as I learned more about how invasive prostate cancer surgery is, that I needed to know a lot more before I was going to hop on the conveyor belt and be shuttled into the operating room.
One of the things I see so often is the fear that grips patients as they're diagnosed with prostate cancer, and especially not knowing that Gleason 6 does not metastasize or leave the prostate in any way. And there's even a big debate in the active surveillance circles about whether it should even be called cancer or not. Most pathologists agree that it's still a variant of prostate cancer, and that's why the term still remains. But the advent of active surveillance and watchful waiting around that time isn't as popular as it is today. So it's amazing that your urologist brought it up, but what was your journey in deciding to choose active surveillance at that time? Because I think that overcoming the anxiety of living with the concept of leaving the tumor in there and living with prostate cancer is quite something to overcome.
One of the parts of the anxiety came more from my wife than it did me. She was horrified because, of course, she heard the C word. For me, on the other hand, this was more of a problem to solve rather than a death sentence. So that made me want to learn more about it. Another credit to the HMO that I belonged to at that time, they had a support group, so they encouraged me to attend it. And I did, in fact, attend several of their sessions. And then one of the guys that was at the session gave me a card for this other support group meeting down at UCSD and says, by the way, you might want to go see these guys. It's got a little bit more in-depth coverage. One of the things that I discovered when I went to my first support group was the wide variety of cases and responses. There was another guy there, same age as me, also with a Gleason 6 diagnosis, and he was scared to death. He wanted that thing out. And yet, sitting across from him at the table was another guy who had had surgery, who later found out that he had low-risk cancer, had surgery, had horrible side effects, and he was a very angry person, and very angry that he did not have the opportunity to learn more about prostate cancer, and specifically his situation, before he made that decision. You had two diametrically opposed people sitting across from each other at this table. Now, a lot of the other men had more advanced cases, and there was a variety of diagnoses within that group. But these two guys really stood out.
How did you handle bringing your wife's level of anxiety down and coming to that conclusion together that you were not going to treat this?
Bearing in mind that I didn't know on day one I was not going to treat it, I was in the education process at that point. The first thing I would say is that there was a high level of trust between my wife and I. She was looking to me to lead this journey and lead the education process. That gave her a little bit of confidence, but it did not alleviate all of her concern. It did not alleviate her anxiety about the idea of being diagnosed with cancer and not doing anything about it. That seemed pretty alien to her. But over time, I became more and more educated, and I shared all of this with her so that she could learn as I was learning about it, and that we could come to an agreement on this. One of the things that made a dramatic difference was the second support group that I went to. I was introduced to the Informed Prostate Cancer Support Group in San Diego. First, I was pretty overwhelmed. It was in a large auditorium. There was 60, 70 guys in there. And I was given a form to fill out with all my gory details of my diagnosis, and I'd be getting a call, to talk more about it, during the week, which did happen. After about 2 or 3 meetings, I really became very skeptical of the conveyor belt route, and I was now learning much more about what watchful waiting was, because in fact, the term active surveillance really was not used very much back then. Watchful waiting just equaled, doing nothing, as opposed to being active and surveilling your cancer journey. So once I got more information from that support group. I then was exposed to Dr. Duke Bond in Ventura and suggested that I go get a color Doppler ultrasound that might help give me more backup for what I want to do, which I immediately did. I got my first report from him, and he said, well, I think active surveillance is a viable option for you. I don't see anything in here that looks, at the very worst, terminal, or at the very least, something that needs treatment right now. He said he wanted to see me come back in 6 months, do a follow-up, which I did, and the follow-up basically backed up the first report. So after I got my first report, and I shared this with my wife, and I also read the book, The China Study, and I also got more information from some other guys in the group, that made the decision for me, which I then shared with my wife, and she kind of reluctantly went along with it. But again, this is where the trust comes in. I said, look, I'm going to modify my lifestyle. I'm going to modify my diet. I'm going to do everything that I can do versus being cut open in order to work with this. And she supported that. And over time, as I learned more, shared more with her, she became a full-blown supporter, advocate of active surveillance, and actually shared some of my indignation towards my urologist's first push to have surgery.
So did you find out about Duke Bond through the support group?
I found out about Duke Bond through the support group.
You were diagnosed at 57, you had a PSA of, 4.1, and then it went to 6, and then you decide to go on watchful waiting at the time, and now we're here talking about active surveillance. So, what was your PSA over that time frame? And then also, how did you decide to stick to it? What was your monitoring process like?
Once I got the spike at 6 in the early stages of this, I told my urologist I did not want to do surgery, at least at this time. I think that's a key feature of active surveillance is that active surveillance isn't anti-treatment, it's anti-unnecessary treatment. I said I would just like to follow this for a while and see how it goes, which he very reluctantly went along with. So at my next visit, my PSA had dropped down to 4.8 or something like that. And so he said, well, I think you should have another biopsy just to make sure that, nothing has gotten worse. And given that it's a random biopsy, you're going to randomly find out if anything got worse. And so I told him about the color Doppler ultrasound, and by that time I'd had a second one. And, he did concede that that had validity, and he would go along with my not wanting another biopsy. We'll revisit it again. So the next time I had it a 6-month PSA, then another 6 month, and it went up a little bit again and went down again. Well, when it went up, he then said, okay, well, you really need a biopsy now. I said, well, we better wait till the next one. The next one went down, and he said, well, I think you need another biopsy. I said, okay, wait a minute. So my PSA went up and I need a biopsy, and my PSA went down and I need a biopsy. What you're telling me is there's not really a correlation here to my needing a biopsy. You're just saying I need another biopsy. Again, I said, no, I'm not going to have another biopsy until there's something confirmatory to say that I should have one at this point. He was not real happy about that, but again, he went along with it. Not long after that, he retired. I got a new urologist, explained the whole thing to him. Actually, he was fine with the active surveillance. And I continued for many years with him until I switched to a new plan when I went on Medicare.
A urologist pushing a biopsy multiple times, and then you deciding over and over again, I'm not going to do it, it is quite a way to advocate for yourself, because a lot of people, I think, kind of think, well, he's mentioned it multiple times, and shouldn't I just do it? So was there ever a time you did go get a second biopsy?
Yes, there was. I used the criteria that if there was some compelling reason that came up, that my urologist or the imaging dictated that I should have another biopsy, then I would do that. Well, on my last visit with Dr. Bond, because he had been advocating for another biopsy, because again, the protocol back in that time was biopsies were looked at as routine. You would just get one every year, even though there was risks in biopsies, even though they're random. However, on this last visit, Dr. Bond finally said, well, there's something in your color Doppler that looks a little suspicious. Little suspicious was good enough for me at that time. So I was kind of honoring his request to finally get a second biopsy after all this time. And then also because he, in fact, thought there might be something there. So we got a 7-core targeted biopsy. And after we got the results, it showed no cancer. I had that sample sent out for a second opinion. The second opinion backed it up. They found no cancer. So essentially from that second biopsy on, which was 10 years ago, I have not had any more biopsies. And the MRIs, between that biopsy and the MRIs, I guess you could probably technically say I don't have cancer and haven't had it all this time. But that hasn't stopped me from being an active surveillance advocate.
Did you find that when you switched to Medicare, the options for you when it came to picking your doctor and everything was just a lot easier?
It wasn't really easier. By that time, I had actually already picked another urologist, and luckily that dovetailed into going into Medicare without any problem. Something I learned early on in my support group, in the Informed Prostate Cancer Support Group, was the importance of being your own case manager. The problem with doctors in general, especially now, is that they just don't have the time to devote to you. They're usually looking at your chart as you sit in the office with them. If you've had the luxury of them looking at it in advance of your meeting, well, that's great, but that's actually kind of rare, unless you have a more serious condition, and then they may be more up to speed. But for most guys, this is not the case. You're basically having to count on them spending 5 minutes reading your chart and 10 minutes talking to you. It really is very necessary for you to be your own case manager. That doesn't mean telling the doctor what they should be doing. This is asking questions to the doctor that you've already looked at and seeing what their responses are. And if for any reason you're not satisfied with those answers, then a second opinion is something that you should look into. Most doctors would respect your request for a second opinion and not feel intimidated. If they are intimidated, then you need a new doctor.
In all your years of experience, then, what would you tell a newly diagnosed patient who is embarking upon this journey and maybe considering active surveillance?
For guys who are low risk, 3+3, and even some 3+4 low risk intermediaries, there's the wonderful thing now of MRIs. And if they have not even had a biopsy yet, they should have an MRI first. Even the AUA now recommends that. By having a MRI and then potentially finding out there's literally nothing there, maybe some BPH, which that's why your PSA went up, or maybe it's prostatitis, that's why it went up, then you can avoid a biopsy, which then can also potentially avoid the conveyor belt routine that I had to endure when I was first diagnosed. MRI is step one as far as being able to find out more about what's going on. If your urologist is talking to you in terms of your PSA is high, The one thing that you'll be able to find out with the MRI is, well, how big is it? Then you'll be able to figure out PSA density, which basically is the ratio between a potentially large prostate and a higher PSA, which does not equal cancer. And having that information, you can then be able to start to feel more confident about going on active surveillance. Being active means being active. So you develop a plan for yourself. What's commonly recommended, one that I follow, is PSAs twice a year. That also requires a visit with your urologist. If there's something that comes along the way that suddenly becomes a little suspicious, like say you've got sequentially rising PSAs and they never go down, or several high rises, then you probably want to come back in with another MRI at that point. And it should also be done by a specialist, someone who is a prostate specialist that can read those reports and know what they are looking at, because a common variety MRI done by someone who, is maybe great at hips doesn't mean they're great at prostates. Diet is another part. Your exercise is another part. Being healthy is a giant part of this, because not only does it make you feel good, it's probably going to allow you to live longer and outlive potential prostate cancer problems.
You mentioned, PSA monitoring every 6 months, but what does your, active surveillance monitoring system look like? And I like the fact that you called it a system. Back then you talked about color Doppler ultrasound, and now we have 3T MRIs. So what does the PSA, monitoring and timeline look like? But also, what does the MRI timeline look like?
In the first 5 years of my journey, I got color Doppler ultrasounds. Prior to that, MRIs were not reliable for imaging and cancer diagnosis, but they were getting better and better and better. After Dr. Bond recommended that I start getting MRIs, I took his advice, and a couple of years later I got my first. It was done by a doctor who had switched his practice to specialize in prostates. He's a radiologist, and he decided to specialize in that. He was one of the first people, I believe, in San Diego that had a 3 Tesla machine. Once he gave me the MRI, it was, again, confirming active surveillance was a good course for me. As MRIs became more and more popular, a system for grading them came into play called the PIRAD system. And that's PIRADS 1 being the lowest, PIRAD 5 being the highest. My first 3 MRIs were graded at PIRADS 2, which again is in the low risk category. My most recent one, which was only earlier this year, was PIRAD 1. So through the course of the MRIs becoming more and more reliable for imaging, for diagnosing prostate cancer, that has become my real fallback for supporting active surveillance.
Thank you so much for sharing your journey. I can't thank you enough. It really is good for patients to be able to hear from the people who have been through it. It's one thing for me to say it as a steward of PCRI, but it's another thing when the patient himself is able to share his experience, and it is tremendously helpful.
You're welcome.
So as you saw today, we talked to Bill about his 14-year journey in the management of his prostate cancer through active surveillance. I think it's an incredible concept because not only did he have prostate cancer, but he decided to watch it for 14 years. I think a lot of times people think of active surveillance as maybe a short-term situation, but in reality it can actually be a very long-term situation where you can avoid unnecessary treatment and manage prostate cancer from just watching it and being active in that process. We're very grateful to him, but we're also grateful to the organization that he's involved with, Active Surveillance Patients International, ASPI. There's a group of men there who are doing an incredible job in providing active surveillance patients active surveillance education. And you can go to their website, aspatients.org, to get involved. They need volunteers, but they also need funding. So if you could donate to them, that would be really great. I know I say donate to PCRI, but today I'm saying donate to ASPI. They're doing a great work in active surveillance. I really appreciate them. It's an honor to be involved, and PCRI is very happy that we get to support them today. So go ahead and go to aspatients.org today.